I'm very pleased and excited that we can do this event because I think there is a lot of interest now about what the future of our relationship with Europe should be. And I think we've got some very good speakers to start that conversation with. And I'm very keen as chair of the Labour Movement of Europe that we will lead that conversation both within the Labour movement and within this country. Whenever you've seen Boris Johnson and his approach to Europe, you know there must be a better way to do things. And we in the Labour Movement Europe are unashamed in our determination to prove that in both word and deed. Joining us this afternoon to start that conversation and particularly look at the key thing, which is trade. We know that there has been a drop of a third of businesses trading with Europe because they've simply given up. And we know that a Labour government would refuse to give up on Britain's best interest, which is to be able to trade with as many different countries as we can, is the Shadow Minister for Trade, Gareth Thomas. And then to look at what the public are saying and thinking about Europe is the pollster Peter Kellner. And I'm going to ask Gareth to kick us off and say a little bit about Labour's current thinking on trade and Europe.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to Labour Movement for Europe. What we're seeing as a result is what's happening on trade with Europe as part of a much broader story of economic mismanagement by the Tories. A builder said similarly to me that the price of bricks that he uses has gone from 33 pence per brick to 67 pence per brick since the end of the transition period. And deliveries of those same bricks have gone from 1 week to 4 weeks before they arrive. And the average cost of a pallet of wine from one of the major wine exporting European countries has up to doubled in price. And that's put, for the average bottle of wine, a rise in the cost from potentially between 58 pence and £1.50. And then the last example I'd offer of the difficulties that people will be familiar with is musicians wanting to travel across Europe for work. There are now real problems they face because it's not any longer a visa-free traveling experience for them. They have to get work permits for every country that they go to. And that's increasingly difficult for them and their crew to do so. But all the businesses I've spoken to stress these problems that they're facing in bringing in goods from Europe or exporting goods and services to Europe are a direct consequence of that, as we all remember, that oven-ready deal we were told from Europe. And that deal's having an impact on inflation, it's having an impact on jobs, and it's having an impact as a result on the cost of living crisis that we're all familiar with. But you have to see it, I think, as part of a decade of mismanagement of the economy by the Tories. Those energy price rises, the strikes we're seeing this week in particular, interest rate rises, the fears that the economy is going into recession, they're not sudden occurrences. And sure, COVID and Ukraine have had an impact, but the story about British trade, which perhaps doesn't get the same immediate attention, is one of slowly falling behind other countries. Over the last 10 years, Britain's growth in exports has lagged significantly behind the rest of the G7. Yet there's been little recognition of that fact from the Treasury or from other government departments. So a couple of examples: American exports between 2010 and 2020 to the rest of the world rose by over 14%. Germany's exports over the same period rose by 13%. On average, exports from G7 countries to the rest of the world rose by 10%. Our exports up just 10%. And indeed, we saw an actual decline in our exports to the world's fastest growing economies in the G20 over the same period, down some 10%. Once upon a time, we were the world's top financial centre for financial services, a huge export earner for the UK. We lost that position in 2018 to New York. Why does it particularly matter that we're doing badly in comparison to other countries in the G7? Well, exports matter to business growth. They help to generate tax receipts. They're a huge factor in our soft power. They're fundamental to job creation. They can be critical for innovation and creativity. And of course, they matter for wages and competition. And the evidence is that jobs that are linked to trade, to bringing in imports and to winning exports pay higher than average wages. Any reduction in exports potentially has an impact on wages. And the Tories' failure in that sense to take serious steps to address the problems that businesses, as you rightly alluded to, are facing trying to get their goods into European markets is going to exacerbate our country's economic problems if we don't tackle that head on when we get into power. The Brexiteers tell us that disruption to trade with Europe has been temporary, short term, as businesses readjust. The trade volumes will pick up, and in any case, there's much greater growth to be had in the Indo-Pacific region with our Commonwealth countries and with India and the US. Many smaller businesses who used to export have stopped doing so, and those small businesses, they're potentially the businesses of the future. That's where potentially the export growth lies. And it's worth stressing that those trade deals that the Brexiteers talk up so much, the trade deals with the Indo-Pacific and the potential idea of Britain joining this new trading arrangement, or relatively new trading arrangement, called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, there was a consultation as to whether Britain should join it. Just 80-odd submissions were handed in to the government, and as a result, they are using that as justification for running to sign up to that deal. The trouble is, this is a deal that they're saying is going to be effectively going to replace the lost trade with the EU. But we already have trading arrangements with most of the countries in the CPTPP already. It's just Malaysia and Brunei, two countries with relatively smaller opportunities for British business that we don't yet have trading relationships with. Whilst they'll be good to have, they're not going to make up for the lost business with the EU. There's trade with Australia and New Zealand. We've got trade deals that have just been done. Again, the small increase in trade that is likely to happen as a result of these deals, good to have, but again, it in no way compensates for the lost EU trade. And it's coming potentially at a high price for our farmers, undermining animal welfare standards, lifting tariffs on goods that directly compete with British farmers. Trade deal with the US and with India too, again, good to have, but will it significantly replace trade that we might lose with Europe? Absolutely not. Just as Rishi Sunak was getting up to deliver the budget back in March, the Office for Budget Responsibility published its revised outlook for the economy. And they made clear that they estimate that total UK imports and exports will be 15% lower in the medium term than if Britain had stayed a member of the European Union. And they couldn't see that any of the trade deals that Britain was committed to joining were going to make any significant impact on that analysis, which is a fairly devastating indictment of the Tories' strategy up to now. But there is an awful lot we can do to improve trade with our European partners. We could, for example, negotiate a veterinary agreement, which would sort out many of the problems that we're seeing in Northern Ireland. We could go out of our way to try and improve relations with the European Union in general terms, and with key allies like France, like Germany, Spain, etc., and those within the Commission, to take some of the tension out of the relationship that exists between Boris Johnson's government and the European Union. We need to make sure that we're defending Britain's interest, but we're using statecraft and diplomacy to lower the tension in the trade relationship in order to get progress. We could be negotiating with each of the countries in the European Union mutual recognition arrangements, so that our professionals, our architects, etc., our musicians can get access to more easily to being able to work unrestricted in overseas market. We ought to be able to resolve key visa problems for different groups, again through negotiation. And if we actually accelerated, put some more investment into borders, accelerated investment in digital borders and products, into improving customs arrangements, again, that would help to reduce some of the tension and delays and bureaucracy in the experiences that businesses have. So there's an awful lot that we could do to improve trade with European Union, beginning with the veterinary agreement, sorting out mutual recognition of agreements, sorting out the problems that some key groups like musicians and others face, more investment in digital borders, and overall building a more productive and cooperative relationship with our partners in Europe.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you for being so clear and frankly so devastating about both the impact that leaving the European Union is having on businesses and having on trade, and also the pragmatism with which we need to now approach tackling these problems for businesses now, because people are struggling now, they're going out of business now. So I'm now going to bring in Peter Kellner to ask him to tell us what the polls are telling us about this. So Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Stella, and thanks, Gareth. I'm going to start going far further back than Gareth said about me at the beginning. A few of you may remember, most of you I hope will know from your knowledge of 20th century Labour politics, what happened in Smethwick in 1964. It was the election that Harold Wilson won, ending 13 years of Conservative rule, but Smethwick, right against the tide, went Conservative. And the reason was there was a virulent local racist campaign. There, almost uniquely, it was a race election. What's less well remembered is that 18 months later, the 1966 general election, Smethwick went right back to Labour. It reversed the swing and more from 1964. So what had happened? Had the people of Smethwick changed their views on immigration? There's no evidence of that. The real difference was the Conservatives, so ashamed of what had happened, fought a normal election. It was back to economics and social advance. This was the high tide of Wilson's popularity. Labour took the seat. The relevance to this is to Europe is this, that the Conservatives want to frame Europe as a cultural issue. Do we have the history to stand on our own? Should we let these dreadful Belgian beer drinkers or French people smelling of garlic or Germans with jackboots rule us? That's the way they would like to frame it. And if we fight on that ground, we lose. I think Europe has to be fought as an economic and social project, but I think we could do much more in terms of economic and social advance. And I'm now going to talk through some polling I've done. We asked, over the next few years, which of these do you think should be the government's priority in developing relations with the EU? 3 options. Whatever's best for living standards, even if this means agreeing common standards with the EU on trades, on food safety, product standards, and so on. That was first option. Second option, Britain should insist on setting its own rules, even if this means less trade with the EU and causes problems for our economy, jobs, and living standards. Third option, it's a false choice. We can set its own rules with no economic harm. Half of the sample said we should do what's best for jobs and living standards, even if it means signing up to European standards. Only 20%, 1 in 5, said we should insist on our own rules, and 16% said it's a false choice. Even if you take the own rules and false choice together, that's 36%. There is still, a clear lead for the economic case. And this is before anybody substantial in politics is actually making that case. This is a starting point. But the other point I make is that Leave voters, Remain voters, as you'd expect, overwhelmingly say we should align our standards for the sake of prosperity. But among the Leave voters, that first option, do what's best, even if this means common standards, that is the most popular option amongst Leave voters, 34%. slightly fewer choose either of the other two options. You can get a decent minority of Leave voters signing up to the economic case. I think you can win that argument on Europe. 41% of Leave voters would be happy for any European Union citizen who has a job to go to come to Britain. So, a very, very large slice of Leave voters, take the two groups together, 49%, a very large slice of Leave voters would accept the economic case for immigrants coming here, for Europeans coming here with jobs to go to. If we can frame Europe as an economic argument, and you've got to do that whatever your policy, if you're going to win any argument in Europe, if you can win the framing of the EU as an economic and social argument, you can go, I think, a lot further towards customs union, towards single market, and towards freedom of movement for workers than people realize. The public is not, there is not a massive groundswell of public opinion against these things if that is how they're framed.
Thank you, Gareth, for making time, and also Peter for all the data. I feel very strongly we have to first name a problem to be able to solve it. Gareth has done a lot of that today about naming the problems that we've got and talked about some of the things that we could solve that. And I hope that members of the LME will reflect on how we can support that work that Gareth is doing. So thank you, gentlemen. We greatly appreciate it, even if you put sexy veterinary agreements and flirting with the Lib Dems into our lexicon today. Hope we will see you at our next webinars. And please do keep the feedback coming about the kinds of issues and concerns that you have as members, because we want to be led by you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this evening. Gareth and I are now off to go and vote to hopefully bring some ethics to this government. We can but live in hope.